At Havenwood Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, a young rescued bobcat was nearing the day he would finally be released back into the forests of Oregon. Wild at heart, he had spent months regaining his strength under careful rehabilitation, destined to return to a life of freedom, but everything changed. When Snowflake, a fragile, trembling white kitten, arrived at the center, from the moment they met, the bobcat's instincts shifted in an extraordinary way. Instead of keeping his distance, he became Snowflake's fierce protector, curling around him day and night, growling low whenever anyone approached the staff. Seasoned in working with wild animals, was stunned, despite extensive preparations. When release day came, the bobcat refused to leave Snowflake's side, pacing anxiously and calling out whenever they were separated. What was driving this wild creature to act so strangely? And why did this solitary hunter seem desperate to protect a creature that wasn't his own kind? What the vets discovered would not only change their lives forever, but would also bring tears to the eyes of even the most hardened veterinarians. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The soft glow of dawn crept through the forest canopy as Dr. Thomas Winters made her morning rounds at Havenwood Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, located in the lush wilderness just outside of Bend, Oregon. Their rehabilitation center had been her life's work for nearly 20 years. The crisp October air filled her lungs as she walked the gravel path between enclosures, clipboard in hand, checking one each of their wild patients. At 58, Thomas had the weathered hands and sun-lined face of someone who had spent decades working outdoors. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and behind her wire-rimmed glasses, her eyes carried both the weariness of someone who had witnessed too much animal suffering and the determined spark of someone who had saved countless lives. "How's our patient in enclosure 12? She asked Tom Redford, their rehabilitation center's head wildlife rehabilitator, who was busy preparing the morning's medications. Scheduled. Tom, a former forest ranger with 30 years of experience in wildlife management, looked up from his work. "The bobcat, he's recovering faster than we expected. The leg wound is healing cleanly, and he's regained most of his muscle tone. I'd say another 2 weeks, and he'll be ready for release." Thomas nodded with satisfaction. "That's a relief. When they brought him in, I wasn't sure he'd make it through the first night." The bobcat in question had been discovered 3 months earlier by a hiker caught in an illegal trap that had left a deep gash across his hind leg. By the time he arrived at Havenwood, he was severely dehydrated, malnourished, and battling infection. The staff had named him Wilder, a nod to both his untamed spirit and the naturalist writer whose words graced the rehabilitation. Since entrance in wildness is the preservation of the world. Wilder was approximately 2 years old, in the prime of his life. With the characteristic tufted ears and muscular build of his species, his russet fur was marked with black streaks and spots, providing perfect camouflage in his native woodland habitat. Unlike many rescued predators who grew somewhat accustomed to human presence during rehabilitation, Wilder remained fiercely independent, watching his caretakers with wary amber eyes that never fully relaxed in their presence. "He's still completely wild," Tom had remarked just the previous week, which is exactly as it should be for a successful release. The bobcat's rehabilitation had progressed exactly according to protocol. They had minimized human contact, provided environmental enrichment that mimicked natural hunting challenges, and gradually increased the size of high-exercise enclosure. As his strength returned, the rehabilitation center's ultimate goal was always the same: return animals to their natural habitat whenever possible. Thomas made a note on her clipboard about scheduling Wilder's pre-release assessment and continued her rounds. Their rehabilitation center was currently housing 27 animals, from injured birds of prey to orphaned deer fawns, each with their own recovery timeline and specialized care needs. What neither Thomas nor Tom could have anticipated was how dramatically their carefully laid plans would change by nightfall. The call came just after sunset. Melissa Jane, the rehabilitation center's on-call veterinarian, answered. On the third ring, Havenwood Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. "This is Dr. Jane." The voice on the other end was young and trembling. "I found a kitten. It's really small, and I think it's dying." The animal hospital in town said. "They're full, and to call you." Melissa sighed. Domestic animals weren't technically within their mandate, but she couldn't bring herself to turn away an animal. Enid, where are you? Just outside the rehabilitation center. Gates, my dad drove me here. Bring it in. I'll meet you at the reception building. 15 minutes later, Melissa was carefully examining the smallest kitten she had seen in her 12 years of veterinary practice. The creature was a scrap of white fur, no bigger than her palm, with blue eyes still clouded by infancy. Its tiny body was racked with tremors and a concerning wee accompanied each breath the girl who had brought him in. Sophie Williams, 14 years old, with tears streaming down her freckled face, hovered anxiously nearby. I found him under our porch. There was no mama cat anywhere. He was all alone, and he's been crying all day. How long has he been like this? Melissa asked, listening to the kitten's chest with her stethoscope. I don't know. I only found him this afternoon, but he looked really bad already. Melissa's examination confirmed her initial concerns. The kitten was severely undernourished, hypothermic, and suffering from a respiratory infection that, left untreated much longer, would certainly prove fatal at approximately 3 weeks old. He should still have been nursing from his mother. We'll do everything we can, she assured Sophie, whose father stood supportively behind her. Can we call you with updates after taking their contact information? And accepting Sophie's tearful goodbye to the kitten, Melissa carried the tiny patient to their rehabilitation sense treatment room. She placed him on a heated pad, administered fluids for dehydration, and started him on antibiotics appropriate for his minuscule weight. Will need round-the-clock bottle feeding, she told Kayla Martinez, the rehabilitation center's newest staff member, who had been assisting with the after-hours admission every 2 hours, including overnight. Can you take the first shift while I prepare a proper incubator setup? Kayla nodded, already preparing the special kitten formula. Does he have a name? Melissa looked down at the trembling white form. Sophie called him Snowflake. It suits him, Snowflake. It is, Kayla agreed, gently stroking the kitten's head with one finger. Poor little guy, you're safe now. Neither woman knew that their new patient would soon turn the rehabilitation sense operation upside down by morning. Snowflake's condition had stabilized but remained precarious. Eleanor, arriving for her regular shift, was surprised to find a domestic kitten in their care, but understood Melissa's decision. We'll contact the local rescue groups once he's stronger, she said. For now, he needs more intensive care than they could provide. The rehabilitation center operated according to strict protocols, particularly regarding the separation of species. Wild animals undergoing rehabilitation were kept isolated from domestic animals to prevent disease transmission, imprinting, or habituation that might compromise their eventual return to the wild patient. Enclosures were arranged strategically with predator species housed far from potential prey species to minimize stress, which is why what happened during feeding time that afternoon defied all explanation. Kayla was carrying Snowflake's incubator to a quiet treatment area for his scheduled feeding when she passed Wilder's enclosure. The Bobcat, normally aloof and disinterested in rehabilitation center activities, suddenly sprang to attention. He approached the mesh front of High's enclosure with unusual intensity, nostrils flaring as he caught the kitten's scent. What happened next caused Kayla to nearly drop the incubator in shock instead of the typical predatory response one might expect from a wild feline encountering a smaller, vulnerable cat. Wilder began making a soft churring sound, a vocalization bobcats typically reserved for their own young Dr. Winters. Tom, you need to see this. Kayla called out, her voice tight with confusion. Thomas arrived first, her expression shifting from annoyance at the interrupted schedule to bewilderment. As she observed Wilder's behavior, the bobcat was now pacing along the edge of his enclosure, eyes fixed on the kitten making sounds none of them had heard from him before. Move the kitten away, she instructed Kayla, her scientific mind already cataloguing the unusual interaction. As Kayla stepped back, Wilder became visibly agitated, pawing at the mesh and vocalizing more loudly. Bring him closer again, Tom suggested, having joined them. Let's see if the reaction continues. When Kayla carefully moved Snowflake's incubator nearer, Wilder immediately calmed, sitting directly opposite the glass front, his eyes never leaving the tiny white form. I've never seen anything like this, Tom murmured. 20 years working with bobcats, and I've never seen one show interest in a domestic cat except as prey. Thomas's brow furrowed. It doesn't make sense from an evolutionary or behavioral standpoint. Bobcats are solitary by nature, even with their own kind. They only come together to mate, or when females are raising young. Should we be concerned? Asked Kayla. Is he seeing Snowflake as prey? Thomas studied Wilder's body language, the relaxed posture, the absence of the predatory stillness that preceded a hunt. The continued soft vocalizations, "No, this isn't predatory behavior, it's almost protective." The three of them stood in puzzled silence, watching as Wilder settled against the front of his enclosure, as close to Snowflake as the barrier would allow. "Whatever it is, we need to maintain protocol." Thomas finally said, "Take Snowflake to the treatment room as planned. The last thing we need is for a wild bobcat to develop an attachment to a domestic animal." Kayla nodded and carried Snowflake away as the kitten disappeared from view. Wilder's distress vocalization echoed through the rehabilitation center, a sound so mournful it caused all three humans to exchange troubled glances that night. Snowflake's condition worsened despite the antibiotics. Histamine, lungs struggled against the infection. His breathing became increasingly labored and his temperature dropped, despite the warming pad beneath him. "I don't think he's going to make it until morning," Melissa told Thomas around midnight, her voice heavy with the weight of impending loss. Both women had stayed late, taking turns monitoring the failing kitten. Thomas rubbed her tired eyes. "We've done everything medically possible, sometimes, especially with neonates this compromised. It's just not enough," as they discussed comfort measures for what they believed would be Snowflake's final hours. Kayla burst into the office, her eyes wide. "Wilder won't stop calling. He hasn't eaten his evening meal, and he's been making that same distressed sound since Snowflake was moved away." Thomas was about to dismiss the information as irrelevant given their current crisis, when Melissa straightened suddenly. "Wait, what if ... She looked at Thomas with the expression of someone about to suggest something professionally questionable. "What if we try something unorthodox?" "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked, too exhausted to dismiss any possibility that might help. Maternal presence has been shown to improve survival rates in failing neonates across multiple species. Heart rate, oxygen levels, temperature regulation, all improve with appropriate physical contact. Melissa, "You can't possibly be suggesting. I'm not saying put them in the same enclosure," Melissa clarified quickly, "but maybe proximity. What if we move Snowflake's incubator near Wilder's enclosure? If nothing else, it might calm Wilder down, so the other animals can rest under normal circumstances." Thomas would have immediately rejected such an unscientific proposal, but with a dying kitten and nothing left to lose, she found herself nodding slowly, strictly, as a palliative measure. She conceded, and with constant supervision, what happened over the next 8 hours would eventually be written up in the Journal of Wildlife Rehabilitation as one of the most unusual cases in the publication's history. With careful precautions, Snowflake's incubator was placed just outside Wilder's enclosure, close enough for the bobcat to see and smell the kitten, but with multiple safety barriers between. Then Wilder immediately pressed himself against the mesh as close to the incubator as possible and began producing a deep rumbling purr that resonated through the small space. By 300 a.m., Snowflake's breathing had eased slightly. By dawn, his temperature had stabilized, and by the time the full staff arrived the following morning, the kitten was taking formula from a syringe with previously unseen vigor. "It's remarkable," Melissa said, reviewing Snowflake's vital signs. "I can't explain it medically, but his will to live seems to have strengthened." Overnight, the staff maintained the unusual arrangement with careful monitoring throughout the day. Wilder remained fixated on Snowflake, barely touching his own food, his attention unwavering when staff members approached to check on the kitten. The bobcat would growl low in his throat, not aggressively, but with clear warning. "It's like he's appointed himself guardian," Tom observed. But why? Thomas had been pondering this question since the previous day. "I've been reviewing Wilder's intake information," she said, spreading a file on the breakroom table, the location where he was found trapped. "I missed it before, but look at this." She pointed to a detail in the report. The hiker who found him mentioned finding the remains of what appeared to be a predator attack nearby. Adult female bobcat, apparently killed within the previous 24 hours. The implications settled over the room. "You think Wilder and that female were Tomagan, possibly mates, or at least in the Same territory. Thomas-supplied bobcats aren't social, but they do have overlapping ranges, particularly during mating season, but that doesn't explain his behavior toward Snowflake. Kayla pointed out, even if he lost a potential mate, why would that translate to protecting a kitten of a different species? Melissa, who had been quietly listening, offered a hypothesis. Trauma responses in mammals can manifest in unexpected ways. There's research showing that animals who experience loss sometimes transfer attachment behaviors to unlikely subjects. It's rare but documented. So what you're saying, Tom summarized, is that our wild bobcat might have experienced a traumatic loss, was then injured, and captured himself, and is now somehow transferring protective instincts. To this kitten, it's a theory. Melissa acknowledged not scientifically proven in this specific interessee's context, but it would explain what we're seeing. Thomas shook her head. The scientist in her still struggling with the irrationality of it all. Whatever. The explanation we need to remember: our primary mission, Wilder, is scheduled for release in less than 2 weeks. We can't allow this unusual behavior to compromise his rehabilitation. The others nodded in agreement, though all of them felt the uncomfortable weight of what that decision would mean as days passed. Snowflake grew stronger. His respiratory infection cleared. He gained weight, and his eyes brightened with the curiosity typical of kittens. His age, the staff maintained the proximity arrangement, having found no scientific reason to end it, while both animals appeared to be thriving. Wilder's behavior, rather than normalizing over time, became increasingly focused on the kitten. When Snowflake was briefly removed for medical treatments, the bobcat would pace anxiously until his return. During the hours they spent near each other, separated by the safety barriers, Wilder would groom himself while watching the kitten, occasionally reaching a paw toward the mesh as if trying to make contact. Word of the unusual relationship spread through the rehabilitation center, staff then to the local volunteer network, and eventually to the wildlife rehabilitation community. Across Oregon, opinions were sharply divided. This is extreme anthropomorphism, argued Dr. James Holden, a visiting wildlife veterinarian from Eastern Oregon University. You're projecting human emotions onto natural behaviors that likely have entirely different explanations. Then explain why his cortisol levels drop when the kitten is present, countered Melissa, pointing to blood work results. Explain why he's only taking full meals when he can see Snowflake. The debate continued among the professionals, but for the rehabilitation center staff who witnessed the daily interactions, the emotional reality was becoming difficult to deny. The most compelling moment came unexpectedly during what should have been a routine handling session for Snowflake. The kitten, now 4 weeks old and considerably more active, wriggled free from Kayla's gentle grip. Hand tumbled to the floor with a startled squeak. Though unheard, his frightened cry triggered an immediate response from Wilder, who launched himself against the mesh with such force that the entire enclosure shuddered. The bobcat's vocalization wasn't a typical predator's call. It was a distress signal that even the most skeptical staff members recognized as concern. Wilder didn't calm until Snowflake had been retrieved, examined, and returned to his incubator visibly unharmed. That evening, Thomas sat late in her office, the rehabilitation center quiet except for the occasional calls of the nocturnal patients on her desk. Lay 2 files: Wilder's release assessment paperwork and the transfer forms that would send Snowflake to Hart's Haven, a respected cat rescue in Portland, once he was weaned. Both animals were progressing exactly as they should medically. By all professional standards, the rehabilitation center was succeeding in its mission. Yet Thomas found herself troubled by the decisions that lay ahead. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Tom entered, carrying 2 mugs of coffee and the weathered expression of someone wrestling with the same dilemma. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. Setting a mug before her, Thomas accepted the coffee gratefully. "I keep telling myself we're following protocol, that this is what's best for them both. First, but in 30 years of wildlife work, I've never seen a bond like this, scientifically unexplainable or not, it's real." She tapped Wilder's file. "We're 2 days from his final release assessment. Everything indicates he's physically ready, but emotionally." Tom settled into the chair across from her desk. "I called Rafael Martinez today." Thomas raised an eyebrow. Rafael was a former Havenwood staff member who now operated Wild Heart Rehabilitation Center, a permanent home for wildlife that couldn't be released back to their natural habitats. "His facility is at capacity. But he knows someone, Lisa Townsend. She has a licensed facility on 40 acres, just outside of Sisters, specializes in cases like this. Cases like what exactly, Thomas asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Non-releasable predators with special circumstances. She has the permits, the experience, and most importantly, the space to keep them both together. Thomas felt the weight of professional responsibility pressing. Against unexpected emotion, we can't make decisions based on sentimentality. Tom, our job is to return wildlife to the wild whenever possible. I agree, Tom said carefully. But our job is also to make decisions based on what will give each animal its best chance at a fulfilling life. The hard question is, what does that mean for Wilder now? Release day arrived with clear skies and a crisp wind that carried the scent of pine through the rehabilitation center. The transport crate sat ready beside Wilder's enclosure, lined with fresh straw and equipped with everything needed for the journey to the release site. A remote area of protected forest where the bobcat would have ample territory and prey. Eleanor, Tom, Melissa, and Kayla stood gathered for the pre-release briefing, reviewing the carefully selected location and post-release monitoring plan. The conversation flowed professionally, each of them committed to the protocol they had followed hundreds of times before, yet none mentioned the white Kitten, currently being cared for in the treatment room, deliberately kept separate from the day's activities. "All right," Thomas finally said, checking the time, "let's proceed with the transfer." The plan was straightforward. Wilder, with a mild sedative, transfer him to the transport crate, while he was calm and begin the 2-hour drive to the release site. By the time they arrived, he would be alert enough for a safe release. Tom prepared feather sedation. While Melissa readied monitoring equipment, Kayla positioned herself to assist with the transfer. The procedure began smoothly, with Wilder receiving the sedative and gradually becoming still enough for safe handling as the team opened the enclosure to move him. However, a sound from the main building caught everyone's attention. The distinctive high-pitched mew of a kitten snowflake, despite being in a closed room some distance away, had begun calling loudly, as if somehow aware of what was happening. Wilder, though sedated, lifted his head at the sound. His ears swiveled toward the noise, and despite the medication in his system, he attempted to stand. "He's fighting this sedative," Melissa said with concern. "We need to move quickly." The team worked efficiently to transfer the bobcat to the crate, but as they secured the door, his behavior became increasingly distressed, even through the fog of sedation Wilder was responding to. Snowflakes continued calls, pouring at the crate door and vocalizing. In return, Thomas watched her professional resolve wavering as the bobcat's distress intensified rather than diminished with time. According to protocol, they should proceed immediately with transport while the sedative was still effective, yet every instinct told her this was wrong. "Wait," she said finally, her voice cutting through the tension. "Tom, call Lisa Townsend." Tom looked at her, understanding immediately. "You're postponing the release?" "I'm considering all options," Thomas corrected, though they both knew what her decision meant. "We need a full reassessment." Later that afternoon, the rehabilitation center staff gathered in the conference room with Lisa Townsend, who had driven immediately from Sisters upon receiving their call. A distinguished woman in her 60s, with sun-weathered skin and calm, evaluating eyes. Lisa had spent 40 years in wildlife rehabilitation, the last 15 focused exclusively on permanently homed predators. "I'd like to observe them together," she said, after reviewing both files, not in the same enclosure yet, but in a controlled interaction setting under careful supervision. Snowflake's incubator was once again placed near Wilder's enclosure. The bobcat, now fully recovered from the sedative, immediately approached and resumed his protective posture. For over an hour, Lisa observed in silence, taking occasional notes, but mostly watching the subtle communication between the two animals. "In my professional opinion," she finally said, "you're dealing with a genuine cross-species bond that has become essential to both animals' well-being. Wilder has formed what we might call an alloparental attachment. He's adopted this kitten, for lack of a better term." "Can he still be released?" Thomas asked, though she suspected the answer. Lisa shook her head. "I wouldn't recommend it. This operation. Trauma would likely compromise his ability to reintegrate into the wild. Successfully, he might seek out human habitations looking for the kitten, refuse to establish proper territory, or fail to hunt effectively due to stress, she continued, addressing the unspoken concern hanging in the room. This isn't about anthropomorphism or sentimentality. It's about recognizing that trauma and attachment exist across species lines and making decisions that acknowledge that reality. Thomas felt the weight. File responsibility shift slightly, and you have the capacity to take them, but I do. Lisa confirmed my facility includes several large naturalistic enclosures designed for permanent residents. Wilder would have nearly an acre of forested space with climbing, structures, hunting enrichment, and appropriate shelter. And yes, Snowflake could remain with him with separate access to indoor spaces for his domestic needs. The team discussed logistics for another hour, legal permits, transportation arrangements, long-term care plans, and the educational component that would allow Wilder and Snowflake's unusual story to serve wildlife conservation efforts. That evening, Thomas sat alone by Wilder's enclosure, watching as the bobcat lay pressed against the mesh nearest to where Snowflake's incubator had been placed. Though she had spent her career maintaining professional distance from her wild patients, she found herself speaking softly to him. "This isn't what any of us planned," she told him, "but maybe it's where you were meant to be all along." The transfer to Wildart Rehabilitation Center took place 2 weeks later. After extensive preparation and the completion of all legal requirements, Lisa's facility nestled in the ponderosa pine forests outside. Sisters provided a compromise between wild freedom and captive security, spacious natural enclosures that allowed Wilder to express his innate behaviors while ensuring his safety and proximity to Snowflake. Eleanor, Tom, Melissa, and Kayla all made the journey to help with the transition, bringing both animals to their new home together. They watched as Lisa expertly managed the introduction to the new space, allowing Wilder to explore while keeping Snowflake in a protected carrier nearby. For reassurance, we'll go slowly with full physical contact. Lisa explained, though given their history, I don't anticipate problems by sunset. Both animals were settling well, with Wilder having inspected every corner of his new territory and Snowflake safely ensconced in a connected indoor area that the bobcat could access through a specialized entry point. Before the Havenwood team departed, Lisa invited them to witness one final moment under careful supervision. She brought Snowflake, now a more robust kitten of 6 weeks, into the main enclosure. Where Wilder waited, the bobcat approached with the same gentle demeanor he had shown through the barriers at the rehabilitation center, sniffing the kitten thoroughly before beginning to groom his white fur with methodical care. Snowflake, showing no fear, curled against the much larger cat's side. His tiny form dwarfed by Wilder's powerful frame, the bobcat circled once before settling. Around the kitten, one protective paw draped over him. Even Eleanor, the consummate scientist, felt tears well in her eyes at the sight. Sometimes Lisa said quietly, "Our job isn't just to heal physical wounds, but to honor the emotional ones too." 6 months later, Thomas received a package from Wild Heart Rehabilitation Center. Inside was a bound photo album and a letter from Lisa detailing Wilder and Snowflake's progress. The photos showed the pair in various settings around their enclosure. Wilder stretched on a high platform with Snowflake perched beside him, both cats investigating an enrichment puzzle, the bobcat watching attentively as the now adolescent domestic cat practiced pouncing. The final page held a printed article from the Oregonian titled "Unlikely Family, the Bobcat, Who Adopted a Kitten." The feature had brought national attention to both rehabilitation centers and, more importantly, raised awareness about illegal trapping and its impact on wildlife. Lisa's letter described how visitors to the rehabilitation center invariably fell silent when watching Wilder and Snowflake interact, how the unlikely pair had become powerful ambassadors for conservation, inspiring donations that funded rehabilitation for dozens of other injured wildlife. "Many people ask me why Wilder chose Snowflake," Lisa wrote. "Scientists might point to displaced nurturing instincts or trauma-induced behavior changes, but everyone who watches them together eventually comes to the same conclusion. What they're witnessing is love, plain and simple, not human love perhaps, but something just as genuine, a connection that transcends the boundaries we humans so often try to impose on the natural world." Thomas placed the album on her office shelf where staff members often paused to look through it during breaks. The rehabilitation center continued its work rehabilitating and releasing scores of wild animals each year. But the story of Wilder and Snowflake remained a touchstone, a reminder that sometimes healing comes in unexpected forms, and that compassion knows no species. At Wild Heart Rehabilitation Center beneath the ponderosa pines of Central Oregon, a bobcat and a domestic cat continued their improbable life together, wild and tame, large and small, united by a bond that defied explanation, but touched every heart lucky enough to witness it. When visitors asked Lisa why, the bobcat hugged the cat so often, curling around him, grooming him, keeping him close, she would smile and tell them the truth. That had brought tears to the eyes of even the most experienced wildlife veterinarians, because sometimes love is the most powerful medicine of all.